This is the first of 2 video lessons on the topic of citing sources, MLA standards and best practices for quoting and documenting sources. This first part I've called mechanics. We'll be looking at punctuation primarily. So we'll start at the very beginning, very basic here. We'll talk about quotation marks and parenthetical citations. Whenever you copy a writer's exact words into your essay, make sure to identify those words using opening and closing quotation marks. It's important to note that with serif fonts like Times New Roman, which you should be using, quotation marks both open facing to the right and close facing left. Direct quotations usually end with a parenthetical citation that comes after the closing quotation marks. Inside the parentheses, you will identify the source of the quotation, typically by the author's last name only, followed by the page number or page numbers from which the quote was taken. You do not need to abbreviate page, and ordinarily a comma after the author's name is not necessary. Those are the 2 most common mistakes that young writers make, is putting a P in there or putting a comma after the author's last name. So here's an example on the left, a screenshot. It shows you direct quotation. The quotation marks are highlighted in yellow. Notice that the opening quotation marks face to the right and the closing quotation marks face to the left. And then my parenthetical citation is highlighted in blue with the author's last name followed by page number. The 12 means page 12. I've blown it up a little bit because I want to point out a couple more things here. First, notice the spacing around the quotation marks and the parenthetical citation. Between the closing quotation marks and the opening parenthesis of the parenthetical citation, there is a space. Also, the terminal punctuation, or the period, comes after the closing parenthesis. It is not after the quotation, it's after the closing parenthesis. So take a moment to look at this parenthetical citation and ask yourself if this one is correct or incorrect. You can pause it if you wish while you think. But the answer is, it is correct. The reason why it's correct is the writer introduced the quote using the author's name. She does not have to include it in the parenthetical citation. So since the writer included the source of the quote at the beginning of the sentence, the page number alone in the parenthetical citation, that's sufficient. Similarly, if you insert multiple quotes from the same source, you do not have to repeat the author's name over and over after the first parenthetical citation. So in this example here, I have 2 quotes from a Sherwood Anderson story, from Hands, the first story, and you'll notice that after the first quotation, my parenthetical citation includes the writer's name, but after the second quotation, it does not. It just says page 15. However, in situations where you quote from multiple sources, you want to make sure it is clear to the reader which is which by including a full parenthetical citation every time you switch. So in this example here, I have 3 quotations. 2 of them are from Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and the one in the middle, in between the 2, that's a quote taken from the introduction to the book. And that's not written by Sherwood Anderson, it's written by someone else named Love. So you'll see there that after my first quotation, I put Anderson 12 in the parenthetical citation. My second quote is not from Anderson, so I have to put Love in there. You might be wondering why I use a Roman numeral for page 7 instead of an Arabic numeral for page 7, and that's because in the introduction to the book, Roman numerals are used instead of Arabic numerals. So I have to keep the pagination that is used in my source. Then I switch back to Anderson for the last quote, And because I cited Love before, I have to make sure that Anderson is back in my parenthetical citation. For the same reason, whenever you start a new paragraph, you should always identify the source in the first parenthetical citation, even if it is the same source that was used in the last citation in the previous paragraph. So in this screenshot, you'll see that I ended a paragraph with a quote from Sherwood Anderson, page 12. I started a new paragraph. I quote Sherwood Anderson again, and I go ahead and put his name in that parenthetical citation as well, because it is a new paragraph. If the source is not paginated, for example, a web page like the one you see here on the left, an article about cannibalism on TV, the author's name is all you need to include in your parenthetical citation. There are no page numbers. So if the author has already been named, you do not need to include a parenthetical citation at all. But if that happens, the writer should look on your works cited page and see that it's a web page, not a paginated source. So in this first example here, I did not identify the author's name, Budowski, in the sentence with the quote. So I go ahead and put it in the parenthetical citation. It's highlighted in yellow, but there's no page number. In this example, I do identify the author of the quote in the sentence that contains the quote, so there is no parenthetical citation in this instance. So let's do some work together. Let's take a look at some sample sentences. You take a few minutes, and you might pause it after each one of these examples and see if you can identify the problem with the quote and the parenthetical citation. Here's the first one. The answer is there should be no comma after Anderson's name. Here's the next one. The problem here is the writer did not put a space between the closing quotation marks and the opening parenthesis of the parenthetical citation. Here's another one. Do not abbreviate page in your parenthetical citation. Here's another one. These are getting a little harder now. Periods and comma should be placed after the closing parenthesis, not inside the quotation. The problem with this one is in the quotation marks. The opening quotation marks are facing the wrong direction. The problem with this one is the writer has misspelled the name of the source. Make sure that you spell proper nouns correctly in your essays. That includes the names of characters, by the way. Some of those are easy to misspell, like Wing Biddlebaum, for example. This one here actually has nothing wrong with it. This one is correct. Okay, let's talk about when to use an author's first name. The first time you identify a source in your essay, it is okay to use the author's first and last name. After that, however, use only the last name. If you cite multiple authors in your essay and they have the same last name, if it's a common last name like Smith, for example, or Jones, you may have to include first names to avoid confusing the reader. But you never identify a source by first name alone. So in this screenshot over here, I identify my source as Sherwood Anderson, and then for the rest of my essay, I'm just going to say Anderson. And I would never say Sherwood. Note that the full name appears in normal order. You should not write Anderson, Sherwood in the body of the essay. Quotes within quotes. This is pretty tricky for students. I often get asked about this. Sometimes you may want to quote a passage, particularly when you're quoting from literature, but this also happens in articles that have quotes. Here's a passage from the story Hands in Winesburg, Ohio. It appears on page 15, and I've included the whole thing exactly as it appears in the book. I'll go ahead and read it. Trembling lads were jerked out of bed and questioned. He put his arms about me, said one. His fingers were always playing in my hair, said another. So if I wanted to quote this passage, there's a problem in that I've got quotation marks around dialogue within the passage. On the right, you see what this looks like if I quoted it in my paper. I have all these opening and closing quotation marks, and it will be very confusing to the reader where quotes begin or end. It's very disorienting. So how do you solve a problem like this? The solution is to replace the double quotation marks in the passage, that is in the passage that I'm quoting, with single quotation marks. This is one of the only situations where it's okay to use single quotation marks. So here's the same passage. This time I took the double quotation marks from the passage I'm quoting and replaced them with single quotation marks. The double quotation marks at the beginning and end identify the whole passage. So this leads to some more questions. What if my quote ends with dialogue? Where do I put the single quote mark? The answer is you put it right inside the double quotation marks. I'll blow that up a little bit so you can see it. There we go. It looks really strange, but if your quote ends with dialogue, single quote mark, no space, followed by the double quotation marks, and then your parenthetical citation. What if I'm just quoting dialogue? Do I still use single quotation marks? The answer to that question is no, you do not. You go ahead and use the doubles. So in this example, it looks like I spelled interrogating. That's kind of funny. The trembling, in the first quotation, trembling lads were jerked out of bed and questioned. He put his arms about, said one. So I put single quote marks around that one. But in the second example, also from the same passage, I do not use the single quotation marks because I'm only quoting the dialogue, so the double quotation marks there are sufficient. Here they are. Ellipses. The ellipsis allows the writer to eliminate unwanted text from the middle of a long quote. You've got a lot of material. You're like, oh, this is 2 or 3 lines long. I don't need all of this. You can cut some things out of the middle, and the ellipsis indicates that you have removed material. It consists of 3 periods. Each period is separated from its neighbor by a single space. The removal of unwanted words must not, however, disrupt the integrity of the source. So it has to make grammatical sense. It has to read like a normal sentence. In many cases, I tell students it's really just easier to break up long passages into smaller quotable units that you can integrate into your writing. This is easier. We'll talk about integration in part 2 of this lesson, the next video in the series. But sometimes you have to do it. Here is a long quote, and what I've highlighted in yellow here is material that I would like to remove. So I like the rest of it. It's kind of long. I want to cut some of it out. It's not important. It's not what I really want the reader to notice. I'm going to get rid of it. And here is what it would look like if I cut those sections highlighted in yellow, and instead I've highlighted my ellipses. So you can compare those two and see how I did it. In most circumstances, you never open or close a direct quote with an ellipsis. There are exceptions to this when quoting poetry. We'll talk about that a little later. But when you're quoting anything written in prose, generally you do not open or close a direct quote with an ellipsis. So see if you can find the mistakes in these examples. Okay, the answer here is, like I said, you don't need ellipses at the start or end of a quote. How about this one? The problem here is spacing. The periods in the ellipsis need to be separated by a space, and also separated from the words that come before and after by a space. So if I took the two examples I just showed you and corrected them, it would look like this. Here they are highlighted in yellow. Timidity with quotation marks around it and a properly inserted ellipsis. Square brackets. Sometimes it's necessary for a writer not to take words out, but to put words into a quotation to provide some context or to clarify meaning. Since this word or these words are not the author's, it is necessary to identify the inserted material by enclosing it in square brackets. However, as with the ellipsis, the addition should not disrupt the grammatical flow of the source. It needs to read like a clean sentence. Again, it may be easier to avoid square brackets altogether by breaking up long passages into smaller quoted units that can be integrated into your writing. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. But here's an example first of a square bracketed material inserted into a quote. So in this example, I thought it was important for the reader to know the identity of the character I'm describing here, so I put him in square brackets. And I needed the preposition of so that it would still read like a sentence, a normal sentence. Another way to deal with this, however, would be to take those quotes, break it down a little bit into parts, and then insert those parts into a sentence of my own, as you see here in this second example. Then I don't have to have the square brackets at all, and this is called integration. And like I said, we'll talk about integration in part 2, the next video in the series. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about quoting poetry. Poetry, lots of things different about poetry. You always cite by line number rather than page number for starters. If it is unclear that you're quoting from a poem, you can include the word lines in your parenthetical citation the first time you cite the work. So here's an example, lines 13 and 14. Usually good editions of poems will have the line numbers out to the side, like you see here. Usually it's every 5 lines. So line 1020 to 1025 to line 1030, so that you can count the lines and identify the lines in your parenthetical citations. In the example here, using integrated quotes, notice how inside the parenthetical citation, multiple line numbers are separated by a comma. So in my first 2 quotes there from Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, nothing like the sun, and then the word reeks, in my parenthetical citation, I have a 1 comma followed by 8 that identifies the 2 lines from which those quotes were taken. A forward slash is inserted in the quotation to indicate line breaks, and that's the second quotation you see there. When quoting multiple lines, make sure to retain the poet's original capitalization. Oftentimes the first word of a new line of poetry is capitalized. And if you quote 4 or more consecutive lines of poetry, they should be formatted as a hanging quotation, and that will be discussed in the second video. So we'll just put a bookmark on that. We'll come back and talk about that later. So line number separated by a comma, a / to indicate a line break in the original source. Notice the spaces around it as well. And then an in- or hyphen to indicate a range of lines. This is also true for page numbers. If you have a quote that starts at the bottom of one page and continues to the top of the next, you'll need to identify both pages in your parenthetical citation, and you use the in- or the hyphen to indicate a range of pages as well as a range of lines if you're quoting poetry. Because poetry and verse drama are so highly structured, the ellipsis is used more frequently than when quoting prose. It is important to make the reader aware if a quote begins in the middle of a line of verse, or if a line continues beyond the end of the quote, or if lines have been omitted entirely. I just said a lot there, so let me give you some examples. Here in the quote, if it's 2 or more lines, which you know here because of the / that tells you I've quoted at least 2 lines, you use the ellipsis to indicate the truncation at the start or end of a line. So I'm telling my reader here with this quote that there was more in this line than what you see. You might be wondering why I did not do that with the 2 quotes above it from lines 1 and line 8 of the sonnet. And the reason is I was not quoting more than one line. I was just quoting a few words from individual lines, so I did not need to use ellipses in those examples. In this speech from Hamlet, the ellipsis indicates that the writer removed the end of the line. When entire lines have been removed, and I really don't think this is going to happen very often, but if it does, you insert periods separated by spaces that extend for roughly the length of a line in the passage quoted. So in this example, I used 30 periods. This is about the same length as a line of pentameter verse. The important thing is that if you do this, you want to make sure that you do it consistently. So I would use the same number of periods every time I omitted a line. That's the end of the first part of this lesson, to be continued in video number 2, which will focus more on the technique, the ways to get your direct quotes into your text, into your prose, so that they look and sound polished.